Great peace, great peace, great peace, Yakoki. You have to understand when a person is asked, are you going to celebrate Juneteenth? And they say, for what? And mind you, right, this is a person who will be considered octoroon class, right? By all definitions of what it means to be a Bruni or what it means to be a coolie, right? Person basically who comes from mixed lineage, maybe a black parent, maybe, an octoroon parent, maybe quadroon, what have you. Sometimes they just have both parents who are octoroon, right? Or octoroon and a quadroon parent, right? When you ask them this and they say, for what? I'm not African. You know what I mean? Like that celebrates the freeing of African slaves. You know what I mean? But this person also doesn't like white people. They don't like them, So at what point do you gauge this person as being like, an antithesis of what it means to spread hate? You know what I mean? Like, at what point do you look at that and say, this person is not only confused about identity, right? Because there's also this thing going around where people are saying race is a construct. Anything to like sort of remove the enthrallment that kind of goes with being African in America and also having ties to Africa back in the diaspora, right? Anything from removing yourself from that responsibility of not even, being with, but just acknowledging, right? Because there's others in the race, right, who come as, First Nation, because if you're a First Nation, this basically means that who your first cousins are back in Sudan or back in Uganda or back in Ethiopia, where you had originally traveled from, right? Because while there is a claim that certain people may believe about the factual evidence that gathers around the ability to have an ethnogenesis, right? You also see that while you're having an ethnogenesis, all that basically means is that you've appeared in the beginning, so this doesn't mean you come from someone, you don't come from someone. It just means the people who you're directly related to in lineal descent, right? And also collineal descent. This means that you all have parentage together, Doesn't mean you come from them. It just means you have parentage together. So you can have a mother and they can have a mother, and then their mothers, right, can have a mother. And this mother could be coming from one place at one time, and then her mother can be coming at another place at one time. And then you all notice like all y'all mothers, right, y'all grandmothers were in also America and in Africa at one point in times. So even the use of the word ethnogenesis, like it needs to be described as to what that means. So I'm not confused when people say things like, Juneteenth is an African holiday. It just means that they don't pay any attention to, the people that's around them in America. A lot of people, they go years and, decades without basically acknowledging people who, may have been instrumental to their path and getting to where they've gotten, right? You got to wonder about that type of anger that builds up in a person. You got to wonder about that, because I know for myself, right, I would never distance myself from Africa. I would never distance myself from my ancestors, right? Um, I would never do something like that, you know. Um, it's just like the chromosome sheeting this line. No, I actually have Nigerian ancestry at 26%. So if you add that up compared to the other uh, chromosome sheets, right, that's probably like two ancestors alone. If it's not two ancestors, it's definitely one, right? Um, so, and then those two ancestors, right, they may have had a child, and then that child may have, had a child with a person from the First Nations of America. That's how you get to who you are, like, existently, right? Um, but, a lot of people, you know, the self-hatred, it builds up after a while. It builds up. Um, depending on your DNA markers, right? You may be a person who would be considered a coolie, right? So that means you have Scottish DNA, you have Irish DNA, and you ignored that, right? You antagonize that part of who you are, right? You're in disbelief, so are you then considered a black extremist? Or again, are you just someone who is, a hate monger? You know what I mean? Because like even me, I don't really look at it in the sense that, people are just as equal in blood percentage as they are in thought. I don't think that's even the case. You have some people who may be coolie who is just down for the African movement. You have some people that's coolie who just hate Africans, for whatever reason. But I'm paying close attention to the voice markers. I'm paying very close attention to, the people who kind of pull other people into the madness that they stir up. I'm paying attention to it, I'm paying close attention to it. You don't need to know how a person looks. You just need to know voice markers, So this tells you where the community standard is. This tells you whether or not you need to have an exodus to a place like Africa. This tells you that. Like maybe you do need to go to Africa. Maybe you do need to start a village in America that's only for Africans. Like maybe you need to do that. I'm completely on board with that idea. Because like if you have a community, right, and you didn't start that community, and like you notice that, like for instance, right, just notice like there's an attribution. Anyone can just move next to you, or anyone could just walk in your area or walk in your vicinity, right? Anyone can just put something in your garbage can. Well, when stuff like that happens, right, you know that either the community is, high component to each other, or it's just like, that could actually turn bad, so like you need a community, and I say this, right? You need a community where everybody looks alike, That's to just stop confusion, you know what I mean? And when you have people who meet up in a certain area and they start to mix and mix and mix and mix, and then this is what you get. You get a genesis of nationality. So they say ethnogenesis, but they don't say natiogenesis, to put it in the Spanish origin. So you can also say anthro or anthrogenesis. They don't say that, like match every component in scientific revelation where it needs to be, right? You have to use the wordage the correct way. You can't have an ethnogenesis without an anthrogenesis. You know what I mean? Great peace, Yakoki.